The Galactic Academy designed a survival test to push students to their limits. Then a human showed up and built a luxury treehouse before lunch. Well, here we are again at the Galactic Academy's so-called character-building program. You know, that delightful little tradition where they take perfectly civilized students and dump them in the wilderness like yesterday's garbage. Because nothing says higher education quite like watching teenagers panic over how to make fire, right? The survival program, oh what a joy. 48 hours of pure, unadulterated terror for most species. But hey, the Academy calls it essential life skills development. Sure, because knowing how to weave grass into shelter is totally going to help when you're designing interstellar navigation systems. Standing in the briefing room, looking absolutely miserable, was our star-studded cast of future galactic leaders. First up, Zephyr, a Calarian, whose anxiety levels could power a small moon. His purple skin was already shifting to that lovely shade of panic green, and we hadn't even left the building yet. Poor guy was practically vibrating with nervous energy, his 6 eyes darting around like he expected predators to burst through the walls any second. Then there was Blip, the Zentorian, who thought he knew everything about everything. Classic overconfident type, you know the kind. Standing there with his crystalline body structure gleaming, chest puffed out, acting like this whole survival thing was going to be a walk in the park. Oh, how wrong he was going to be. The best part, he'd never actually been outside a climate-controlled environment in his entire 300-year lifespan. And our logical friend Flux, the Andromedean, whose idea of problem-solving involved running complex mathematical equations in his head. Great for quantum physics, not so much for how do I not die in the woods. His metallic features were set in that perpetual expression of calculating probabilities, probably running through every possible disaster scenario. Spoiler alert, he missed the big one. But then there was the human. Sarah Chen, exchange student from that crazy little blue planet called Earth. While everyone else was having what could generously be called pre-survival breakdowns, she was just standing there, casual as you please, checking her fingernails like she was waiting for a bus, not preparing for what most species considered a legitimate survival horror experience. The other students kept shooting her these sideways glances, probably wondering if humans were just too stupid to understand the concept of mortal danger, or if there was something they were missing. Spoiler alert. There was definitely something they were missing. Professor Grimlock, bless his ancient Thurian heart, stood at the front of the room looking like death warmed over. 300 years of teaching, and he still couldn't figure out why the Academy thought this was a good idea. His massive frame towered over the students, rocky exterior cracked with age, and what could only be described as professional exhaustion. "Students," he began, his voice carrying that special quality of someone who had given this speech way too many times, "you will be transported to Survival Zone 7 Alpha. 48 hours. Standard emergency beacon for life-threatening situations only. Basic supplies, water purification tablets, emergency rations for 12 hours, basic medical kit, and 1 multi-tool per team." The panic in the room was practically tangible. Zephyr's color shifted to full panic mode rainbow, cycling through the entire spectrum of Calarian distress. Blip's confident posture wavered just slightly, which for a Zentorian was basically the equivalent of a complete meltdown. Flux was calculating so hard you could practically hear his processors overheating. Sarah yawned. Actually yawned. "The objective," Professor Grimlock continued, clearly trying to ignore the rising tide of student anxiety, "is to demonstrate basic survival skills, teamwork and adaptability. You will work in assigned groups of 4. Shelter, fire, food procurement, water sourcing. Simple enough concepts that any intelligent species should be able to manage." Oh, the irony. The beautiful, beautiful irony of that statement. "Group assignments are final," Grimlock announced, pulling up the holographic display. "Team Delta, Zephyr, Blip, Flux, and..." He paused, probably for dramatic effect, or maybe he was just tired. Sarah Chen. The silence in that room was deafening. 3 alien students staring at their human teammate, trying to figure out if they'd just won the lottery, or been handed a death sentence. Sarah just shrugged, apparently viewing this whole thing as mildly interesting at best. "Transportation leaves in 30 minutes, Grimlock concluded. "Try not to die. The paperwork is terrible." And with that inspiring send-off, our merry band of future disaster victims headed toward what would become known throughout the Academy as the human treehouse incident. Nobody saw it coming. Well, except maybe Sarah, but she wasn't telling. The transport shuttle dropped them off with all the ceremony of a garbage disposal unit. 1 minute they were in comfortable, climate-controlled safety, and the next, they were standing in what could generously be called nature's armpit. The trees loomed overhead like judgmental giants. Birds made sounds that seemed specifically designed to unnerve civilized beings, and the ground was covered in what could only be described as organic matter of questionable origin. Zephyr immediately went full-spectrum panic mode, cycling through colors that probably hadn't been seen since the Great Calarian Anxiety Crisis of 2847. His 6 eyes were moving independently, trying to track every shadow, every sound, every potential threat in a 360-degree radius. The poor guy looked like he was about to vibrate right out of his own skin. Okay, everyone stay calm," Blip announced, his crystalline structure catching the sunlight in what he probably thought was a confidence-inspiring way. "I've read the theoretical frameworks for wilderness survival. We need to prioritize shelter, water, fire, food. Basic hierarchy of needs, nothing complicated." Flux was already running calculations, his metallic head tilting at angles that made everyone slightly uncomfortable. Probability of successful completion with 0 practical experience, 14.7%. Factoring in environmental variables and species-specific physiological requirements, our odds decreased to approximately 8.3%. "Thanks for that morale boost," Zephyr squeaked, his voice hitting octaves that shouldn't have been physically possible. Meanwhile, Sarah was walking around the clearing like she was on a casual stroll through a shopping mall. She kicked at some fallen branches, examined the tree canopy, tested the soil with her boot, and generally acted like being dumped in the middle of nowhere was just another Tuesday. "So," she said, picking up a sturdy-looking branch and giving it an experimental swing. "Anybody else notice those storm clouds rolling in? Looks like we've got maybe 4 hours before it gets nasty." The aliens followed her gaze and sure enough, dark clouds were building on the horizon, clouds that looked distinctly unfriendly, and full of the kind of weather that made most species run for the nearest climate-controlled bunker. "Storm clouds," Flux repeated, recalculating. "Precipitation probability 92%, temperature drop anticipated. Survival probability now approximately 4.6%. Will you stop with the death statistics?" Zephyr wailed, his color pattern now resembling a kaleidoscope having a nervous breakdown. Blip was trying to maintain his air of confident leadership, but even his crystalline structure was starting to show stress fractures. "Right, so we need immediate shelter. I suggest we find a cave or natural formation that can provide protection from the elements," Sarah snorted. "Cave? In this terrain? Good luck with that." She was already gathering materials, seemingly at random. Long straight branches, shorter pieces of wood, what looked like vines, and various other forest debris. The aliens watched her with growing confusion as she sorted everything into neat piles. "What exactly are you doing?" Flux asked, his logical mind trying to process the apparent randomness of her actions. "Building shelter," Sarah replied, like it was the most obvious thing in the galaxy. "But you haven't even analyzed the optimal location yet," Blip protested. "Or calculated the structural requirements, or determined the most efficient design parameters." Sarah paused in her gathering to look at him with what could only be described as amused pity. "Dude, it's a shelter, not a space station. You find a good spot, you build something that keeps the rain off, and you don't die. Pretty straightforward." While the aliens continued their increasingly frantic debate about theoretical survival strategies, Sarah had moved to a cluster of sturdy trees and was examining them with the kind of focused attention that made everyone else nervous. She was looking up at the branches, measuring distances with her hands, and nodding to herself like she'd just solved some complex equation. "I vote we head toward higher ground," Zephyr suggested, his anxiety making him sound like a squeaky toy. "Floods are a significant concern in storm conditions." "Actually," Flux interjected, "higher ground increases exposure to lightning strikes. We should seek the lowest possible elevation." "Are you insane?" Blip's crystalline form was practically glowing with stress. Low ground means water accumulation, potential drowning hazard, and exposure to ground-dwelling predators. While they argued, Sarah had started doing something that made absolutely no sense to any of them. She was climbing one of the trees, not just climbing, but climbing with purpose, like she actually knew what she was doing. She was testing branches, measuring distances, and generally acting like she'd been born in trees instead of on some distant planet. "What is she doing now?" Zephyr whispered, as if speaking too loudly might somehow make their situation worse. "I believe," Flux said slowly, his processors working overtime, "she is ascending to gain a tactical overview of the terrain. Or she's having some kind of primitive human instinctual breakdown," Blip suggested hopefully. "Maybe the stress of survival is triggering ancestral behaviors." From 20 feet up in the tree, Sarah's voice drifted down. "Found the perfect spot. This is going to work beautifully." The three aliens looked at each other with the kind of expression usually reserved for beings who have just realized they're trapped in a situation with someone who might be clinically insane. The storm clouds were getting closer, and their human teammate was talking to trees like they were old friends. This was going to be a very long 48 hours. What happened next defied every law of physics, logic, and common sense that the three alien students thought they understood about the universe. While they stood around debating the theoretical implications of shelter construction, Sarah had apparently decided that talking was for amateurs and action was for humans. She descended from the tree with the kind of fluid grace that made it look like gravity was just a suggestion she occasionally followed. In her hands, she carried what looked like measurements made from nothing but eyeballing distances and some kind of mysterious human intuition that apparently worked better than Flux's computational systems. "Right," she announced, dusting bark off her hands. "I need about 30 straight branches, roughly 2 meters long, 16 shorter cross supports, and something to lash it all together. Oh, and those vines over there look perfect." The alien stared at her like she'd just announced her intention to build a faster-than-light drive out of tree branches and good intentions. "You're going to build a shelter," Blip said slowly, "out of sticks and vines," Sarah added helpfully, as if that made the whole thing perfectly reasonable. Flux's processors were clearly overheating. The structural integrity of organic materials in a load-bearing configuration, without proper engineering calculations, is fundamentally unsound. The failure rate approaches 99.8%. Sarah looked at him with the kind of patient expression usually reserved for small children who've just asked why the sky is blue. "Buddy, humans have been building stuff out of wood for about 10,000 years. I think we've worked out most of the bugs." While they continued to debate the impossibility of what she was proposing, Sarah had started working. And when I say working, I mean working like some kind of construction machine that had been disguised as a small human female. She was cutting branches with the multi-tool, measuring distances with her hands, and sorting materials with the kind of systematic efficiency that made Flux's logical mind start twitching. "She's actually doing it," Zephyr whispered, his color cycling through shades of amazement and terror. "She's building something." And build she did. While Blip tried to calculate optimal shelter designs using crystalline mathematics, while Flux ran probability assessments on structural failure modes, and while Zephyr panic cleaned the same pile of leaves 17 times, Sarah was constructing what could only be described as engineering magic. She started with a foundation, laying out a framework between 3 trees that formed a natural triangle. The base platform went up first, supported by a network of branches that somehow locked together like she'd been doing this her entire life, which, considering she was human, she probably had been. "The load distribution," Flux muttered, watching her work, "is actually quite elegant. The triangular design provides optimal stability while minimizing material stress points." "Don't sound so surprised," Sarah called out, hoisting another beam into place. "We figured out triangles a few thousand years ago too." Next came the walls, if you could call them walls, more like a framework of interwoven branches that somehow managed to look both rustic and structurally sound at the same time. She was lashing joints with vines, creating connections that held firm under pressure testing that would have made an engineering professor weep with pride. The 3 alien students had stopped their panicked planning, and were now just watching, transfixed by the sight of their human teammate casually defying everything they thought they knew about construction, physics, and the fundamental nature of reality. Is she, Zephyr asked quietly, building this thing in the air? Because that's exactly what she was doing. The shelter wasn't just a ground-level lean-to or a basic debris hut. Sarah was constructing what appeared to be a genuine multi-story, elevated structure. In the trees, like some kind of arboreal architect who had decided that ground-level construction was for species without imagination. It's a treehouse, Blip said, his crystalline structure flickering with something that might have been awe. She's building an actual treehouse. The platform was 12 feet off the ground, accessed by a ladder she'd constructed from notched branches and secured with vine lashings that looked like they could support the weight of a small spacecraft. The walls were going up with interlocking panels that provided both structural integrity and weather protection. Flux was calculating frantically, trying to understand how any of this was possible without proper tools, blueprints, or at least a basic understanding of engineering principles. The joinery technique she's employing shouldn't work without metal fasteners or modern adhesives. Tell that to the treehouse, Sarah replied, installing what appeared to be a functional door. Besides, your ancestors probably built stuff like this too, before they discovered climate control and forgot how to use their hands. The roof went on next, a slanted design that would shed water runoff while providing maximum internal space. She was weaving smaller branches and leaves into a waterproof thatch that looked like it belonged in an architectural magazine. If architectural magazines featured structures built by apparently superhuman beings using nothing but forest debris. 2 hours. 2 hours from start to what was clearly going to be finish, and Sarah had built something that looked more like a vacation rental than a survival shelter. It had levels, for crying out loud, multiple rooms. What appeared to be a rainwater collection system integrated into the roof design. I don't understand, Zephyr said, his anxiety now replaced by complete cognitive overload. How is this possible? Meanwhile, the storm clouds were getting serious, and the wind was picking up. The other student teams scattered throughout the forest were probably huddled under makeshift lean-tos made of leaves and hope, praying to whatever deities their species favored that they'd survive the night. Sarah hammered in the final support beam, tested the structural integrity by bouncing on the platform a few times, and nodded with satisfaction. There we go, home sweet home. The 3 aliens stood in the gathering dusk, staring up at what could only be described as a masterpiece of improvised engineering, trying to process the fact that their human teammate had just built a luxury treehouse in the time it had taken them to argue about whether they should prioritize fire or water procurement first. I think, Flux said slowly, we may have underestimated human capabilities. The first drops of rain began to fall and Sarah grinned. Come on up, let's see how she handles the weather test. The storm hit with all the subtlety of a quantum torpedo to the face. Rain came down in sheets that turned the forest floor into a muddy swamp within minutes. Wind howled through the trees like some ancient beast with a serious grudge against anything not nailed down. Lightning split the sky with enough electrical fury to make even Flux's circuits nervous. And there they were, 4 students sitting comfortably in what could only be described as the most over-engineered survival shelter in galactic history, completely dry and utterly safe while nature threw its worst tantrum outside. The treehouse didn't just survive the storm, it laughed at it. Rain rolled off the thatched roof like the building had been designed by someone who understood weather patterns better than the meteorologists. The walls held firm against wind gusts that were bending full-grown trees. The elevated platform kept them well above the flooding that was turning the forest floor into a temporary lake. This is impossible, Zephyr whispered, his color patterns finally stabilizing into something resembling calm amazement. Structures built from organic materials shouldn't be this stable in extreme weather conditions. Sarah was leaning against one of the support posts, looking completely relaxed while outside the storm raged like the universe was having a temper tantrum. Humans have been riding out storms in wooden structures for millennia. You just have to understand how wood behaves under stress and plan accordingly. Flux was running structural analysis calculations that kept coming back with results his logical mind couldn't process. The engineering principles you've employed are sound,
but the implementation without proper tools or materials should be impossible. The tensile strength of vine lashings alone shouldn't support this load distribution. Maybe your calculations are missing something, Sarah suggested with a shrug, like practical experience. Blip had gone completely silent, his crystalline structure dim with what could only be described as existential confusion. His entire world view about survival, construction, and the fundamental nature of problem-solving had been thoroughly demolished by watching one human casually build a luxury treehouse using nothing but forest debris and apparently supernatural competence. The storm raged for 6 hours. 6 hours of wind, rain, lightning, and generally hostile weather that would have turned most improvised shelters into kindling, and their occupants into very wet, very miserable statistics. But Sarah's treehouse held firm, kept them dry, and even managed to collect enough rainwater in the integrated gutter system to refill their water supplies. When morning finally broke through the storm clouds, revealing a forest that looked like it had been through a blender, Professor Grimlock arrived for the routine check-in that was supposed to assess their basic survival progress. What he found instead broke his ancient Thurian brain. "What?" he said slowly, staring up at the treehouse complex that had somehow materialized overnight. "In the name of the 7 sacred moons is that?" "Our shelter," Sarah replied cheerfully, climbing down from what appeared to be a functional balcony. "We had a pretty good storm last night, but everything held together nicely." Grimlock's rocky features cycled through expressions that suggested his 300-year-old mind was having trouble processing what his eyes were reporting. "That is not a shelter, that is architecture." The other 3 team members climbed down after Sarah, looking like beings who had experienced something that fundamentally challenged their understanding of reality. Zephyr's colors were cycling through patterns that didn't exist in standard Calarian emotional spectrums. Flux's logical processors were clearly running in emergency mode. Blip looked like his crystalline structure had been reorganized by exposure to impossible events. "How?" Grimlock demanded. "Did you construct this in less than 24 hours?
Sarah looked genuinely confused by the question. "Basic camping skills. I mean, it's not like I built a mansion or anything. Just a simple treehouse with weatherproofing and structural reinforcements for storm resistance." "Basic camping skills," Grimlock repeated slowly, like he was testing the words to see if they made sense in that particular combination. "Yeah, you know, standard human stuff. My dad taught me when I was 8. We used to build forts in the woods behind our house every summer." Sarah paused, noticing everyone staring at her like she'd just announced her ability to bend space-time with her thoughts. "Is this weird? This seems like it should be normal survival stuff." The professor pulled out his communicator with hands that were definitely not steady. "Academy Command? Professor Grimlock here. We have a situation in Survival Zone 7 Alpha. I need immediate consultation with the Xenobiology Department and possibly the Physics faculty." "Problem with the exercise," came the crackling reply. Grimlock stared at the treehouse, then at Sarah, then back at the treehouse. The human built a luxury resort. There was a long pause from the communicator. "Come again." "The human student has constructed what appears to be a multi-story weather-resistant architecturally sound dwelling using only forest materials and apparently supernatural construction abilities. Current structure includes load-bearing support systems, integrated water collection, and what I believe may be a functional ventilation system." Another pause. "Grimlock, have you been sampling the fermented fruit again?" "I am sending visual confirmation now," the professor replied grimly, activating his recording device. "And I am formally requesting immediate policy review regarding human participation in survival exercises." Sarah was looking increasingly concerned about the level of attention her perfectly reasonable treehouse was generating. "Guys, seriously, it's just basic woodworking. Any human with Boy Scout training could have done this." "Boy Scout training," Flux repeated, his processors apparently stuck in some kind of logic loop. "What?" Zephyr asked in a small voice, "is Boy Scout training." And that's when everyone realized they might have seriously underestimated what humans considered basic life skills. The emergency council meeting at Galactic Academy was called exactly 17 hours after Professor Grimlock's incident report reached the administration. 17 hours of increasingly frantic communications between department heads who were trying to figure out how to handle what was being called the human problem. Chancellor Vorthak, a distinguished Xerilian whose 400 years of educational administration had prepared her for many things, but apparently not this, sat at the head of the conference table looking like someone who had been asked to solve a puzzle made of pure impossibility. "Let me make sure I understand the situation correctly," she began, her tentacles twitching with barely controlled academic anxiety. "One human student, using only basic forest materials, constructed what our engineering department has classified as a structurally superior dwelling in approximately 6 hours. 6 hours and 14 minutes, corrected Professor Kelnack from the engineering faculty, his insectoid features clicking with what might have been professional distress. "We've analyzed the holographic records. The joinery techniques alone represent construction methods that most of our students couldn't replicate with proper tools and unlimited time." Dean Throplex of Xenobiology was flipping through data files with her multiple arms, each appendage handling different reports simultaneously. "The psychological evaluation of the human subject shows no abnormal stress indicators, no enhanced physical capabilities, and no signs of advanced technological augmentation. According to her own testimony, this represents what humans call normal camping skills." "Normal," Chancellor Vorthak repeated, the word carrying the weight of someone trying to process information that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality. She considers architectural engineering to be normal recreational activity. "Furthermore," Dean Throplex continued, "we've reviewed human historical records. Construction techniques of this complexity were apparently standard knowledge among human civilian populations for thousands of years. Children were taught these skills as routine education. The silence in the room was the kind that usually preceded either profound revelations or complete mental breakdowns among academic professionals. Professor Grimlock, still looking somewhat shell-shocked from his field experience, cleared his throat. "There's more. When I asked the human what she would have built with better materials and more time, she mentioned something called log cabin construction and stone masonry techniques. Apparently her grandfather taught her to build structures that could last for centuries using nothing but locally sourced materials." Chancellor Vorthak's tentacles had gone completely still, which in Xerilian body language indicated either deep concentration or impending cognitive failure. "Are you telling me that humans routinely possess construction knowledge that surpasses our engineering curriculum?" "It gets worse," Dean Throplex said, consulting another file. "We've been researching human educational systems. They have something called vocational training, where adolescents learn practical skills including carpentry, plumbing, electrical work, and mechanical repair, as standard curriculum." The implications of that statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket of existential dread. "So," Chancellor Vorthak said slowly, "when we designed our survival program to test basic competency in hostile environments, we accidentally created a situation where the human student was essentially asked to demonstrate recreational skills she learned as a child." "That appears to be accurate," Professor Grimlock confirmed miserably. Director Quilnex from Student Safety, whose job it was to worry about liability issues, spoke up for the first time. "We need new protocols. Immediately. If human students possess capabilities that exceed our current assessment parameters, we're looking at potential safety issues, educational inadequacy, and possible legal complications." "What kind of new protocols?" the Chancellor asked, though her tone suggested she was afraid of the answer. "Human preparedness warnings," Director Quilnex replied grimly. "Full disclosure to all faculty about human capabilities, modified assessment criteria for mixed species classes, and possibly separate survival exercises designed specifically for students who consider treehouse construction to be elementary skill sets." Professor Kelnack was still analyzing the construction data. "The structural mathematics alone suggest an intuitive understanding of load-bearing principles that would qualify as advanced engineering knowledge. How is this possible without formal education? According to human records," Dean Throplex explained, "they call it learning by doing. Apparently practical application of physical principles through direct experience creates intuitive understanding that doesn't require theoretical education." "Learning by doing," the Chancellor repeated, as if testing whether the concept made sense in any known educational framework. "The human student also mentioned something called YouTube tutorials," Professor Grimlock added helpfully. "Apparently humans share practical knowledge through visual demonstrations accessible to their entire population. Construction techniques, repair procedures, survival skills, all freely available to anyone with basic technology access. The room fell silent again as the assembled faculty tried to process the implications of a species that casually shared advanced practical knowledge as entertainment. So Chancellor Vorthak said finally, "We have a species that teaches construction engineering as childhood recreation, shares advanced technical knowledge as popular entertainment, and considers wilderness survival to be basic life competency." That appears to be correct. Everyone confirmed simultaneously. Right, the Chancellor decided, her tentacles moving with renewed purpose. New policy, effective immediately. All human students will receive modified assessment criteria. All faculty teaching mixed species classes will receive briefings on human capabilities. And someone get me a full report on what other basic skills humans might possess that we should know about. What about the survival program? Professor Grimlock asked. Chancellor Vorthak looked at him with the expression of someone who had learned that everything she thought she knew about educational methodology was woefully inadequate. Humans get their own category. And next time, maybe we should ask them what they consider challenging before we design the test. The human preparedness protocols were implemented the following semester, and never again would faculty make the mistake of assuming that any species' basic skills were actually basic.